All right. Good morning, and thank you for taking your valuable time to join us today. My name is Richard Lawless, and I am the CEO of Commercial Solar Power. Just some housekeeping. The restrooms today are in the main lobby on this floor. We'll be streaming this presentation over the internet. And when we do questions and answers, we're going to do those at the end of the presentation, and we'll take turns between the live audience and those who are participating on the internet. Commercial Solar Power is not a company that was going to change the world. I am not anybody of any significant importance, but the story I'm going to tell you today is important, and I hope you get as much out of it as we put into it. So let's get started. Our goal today is to share what we have learned about this widespread criminal fraud taking place on Wall Street, share what we have learned about the massive theft that's taking place in many municipal agencies, share what we have learned about the complexity and the complicity of our legislators and the Department of Justice in these criminal enterprises. And our hope is that this information can be disseminated by the members of the press and that public pressure can be brought to bear on the legislators to prosecute these individuals and end these practices. Today's agenda: who is Commercial Solar Power and why do they care? That's probably the most common question I get. Who is the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, also known as PREPA? Critical background information that is necessary to fully understand the scope of this criminal enterprise, related legislative actions and decisions, and questions and answers when we're all through. Commercial Solar Power started as Solar Power Systems in 2007 and merged with another firm to create Commercial Solar Power in 2010. CSP, as it's known, is a utility-scale renewable energy development company. Put simply, we build renewable energy power plants for utility companies. The development process that we engage in takes 18 to 36 months and can cost many millions of dollars. CSP secures the utility contract to buy the electricity, secures the land, ensures that the electricity can move through the transmission lines to where it's needed, secures all permits and approvals, and designs and engineers the site. The average 20 megawatt project can cost anywhere from $65 to $120 million. And this year, PREPA issued, or I should say in 2011, PREPA issued 75 contracts worth $1.5 billion to secure renewable energy for their utility company. CSP secured one of those contracts to construct a solar power plant. Here's an example of the kind of projects that Commercial Solar Power works on. And this is exactly the type of project we were planning to do in Puerto Rico. Who is the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority? In 2011 to 2013, CSP went through the process with the Puerto Rico Power Authority, also known as PREPA. PREPA is the world's largest government-owned utility company. In 2011, PREPA was given a credit rating of BBB+ by the three major credit rating agencies: Moody's, Fitch, and S&P. BBB+ is a strong rating for any utility company and indicates that our project would be financeable and that the utility is likely well run. We selected PREPA, or the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, for a number of reasons. Among them, they have the highest electricity rates in the industry, among the highest electricity rates in the industry, certainly in North America. They're heavily dependent on oil imports, and they have terribly obsolete equipment. All of those factors make them a great candidate for renewable energy alternatives. PREPA appeared to be the perfect client for renewable energy. It would reduce pollution throughout the island, reduce dependence on oil imports, and most importantly, renewable energy would reduce electric rates, spurring economic growth throughout the island. electricity rates play a huge factor in the manufacturing business and in some services businesses as well. And Puerto Rico's economy was suffering from the extremely high electric rates the island was charging its customers. I want to give you some critical background information now that'll help you better understand what I'm about to tell you and keep you more informed about how this process really works. Government agencies raise debt by issuing municipal bonds and bank borrowings. A municipal bond is simply a loan that the municipal agency requests, and instead of requesting it from a bank, they'll put together a package of information and send it out to hundreds of thousands of individuals, and they will lend the utility money by purchasing an interest in this bond. The utilities also do a small portion of their borrowing, relatively small portion of their borrowing, from major Wall Street banks. There are roughly $4.2 trillion in the municipal bond market today. This has been growing at a frightening rate since 2007, and I think refinancing of municipal bonds has even been more astounding. It's growing exponentially since 2007. There are 59 million Americans that hold municipal bonds, according to the Federal Reserve. Municipal bonds are a favorite investment of senior citizens who use the tax-free income to supplement their retirement incomes. Approximately 80% of these bonds are bought by seniors and held directly. They hold the bond directly, or they own an interest in that bond through a mutual fund. Now, most senior citizens prefer to buy municipal bonds directly because they feel they'll be less volatile. They'll know that they'll get their interest payment every 6 months. They know the bond's going to mature in 20 years, and it's something they feel they can count on through their critical retirement years. Younger investors and wealthy investors tend to invest in municipal bonds in a mutual fund that holds a number of different bonds, and they have a small interest in each of those bonds that the municipal bond holds. The mutual fund holds. And this is going to be interesting to you. The average municipal bond investor has an income under $50,000 a year, and they hold about $7,500 in various bonds, which represents 30% of their overall retirement savings. There's a misconception out there that only wealthy people buy bonds or municipal bonds, and that is far from the truth. The target market for municipal bonds is clearly people between the ages of 55 and 75 years old looking for safe, steady, reliable retirement income. And this is what makes the bond buyers the perfect victims. At $50,000 a year, with $7,500 representing 30% of their overall savings, they're not in a position to explore, investigate, or fight retirement or income losses, investment losses that they think may not have been appropriate. Unfortunately, they quietly take that loss and move on. And that, again, makes them the perfect victims for what I'm about to discuss with you. Puerto Rico issued $70 billion in bonds that were purchased by Americans in all 50 states. For example, New York residents purchased slightly over $2 billion of Puerto Rico bonds. Florida residents, slightly under $2 billion. California, $1.7 billion, and so on and so forth. When Puerto Rico began to have trouble paying its bills, the $70 billion in bond debt dropped in value by between 50 and 70%. Nearly 80% of the original bondholders sold at a loss during this time period. And whenever you're selling stocks and bonds at a loss, there's got to be a buyer. And I want to talk to you about that. In this case, the hedge funds as a group came in and aggressively purchased a lot of the Puerto Rico bonds. The hedge funds provide a variety of services. It's very common for hedge funds to assume high levels of risk. Hedge funds will often look for troubled financial situations where they can purchase and hold assets until the financial turmoil settles down, presenting them with an opportunity to resell those assets for a very high profit. I think you need to look at a hedge fund a little bit the way you would look at a tow truck operator right after the scene of an accident. They'll show up, they'll try to remove the debris, bring it to an auto mechanic, repair it, resell it as best they can. So they serve a solid and important function for the markets. Most individual investors sold their Puerto Rico bonds, and many mutual funds sold their bonds when Puerto Rico's trouble began. The hedge funds came in to buy the bonds at a discount, hoping to double their money. The hedge funds purchased the debt at 30 to 40 cents on the dollar, hoping for long-term recovery. The hedge funds are hoping to resell these bonds at 60 to 80 cents on the dollar sometime in the future. Without these dramatic drops in value, the hedge funds would have not been involved in this financial mess. The opportunity would not have been there, and they would have shown no interest. But this is the important point I want to drive home today to our listeners. The losses already happened. The individual investors lost 60 to 70% of their money when they sold. The hedge fund activity is only an after-the-fact side story. $70 billion, 80% was owned by individuals for a total of $56 billion, with an average sales price of 35 cents on the dollar. The losses totaled $36 billion. Now, for it to be an investment loss, you'd have to be honestly and fully informed about the investment and make that investment under your own free will. But if that investment or those funds were derived using deceit and fraud, it's simply theft, a fraud, a criminal act. My proposition today is that that money was stolen from American senior citizens, and it's gone forever. And our government confiscated what was left. And none of this would be possible without the credit rating agencies. The credit rating agencies are the hub in the wheel. The agencies, much like a home appraiser, look at the pool or specific bond and offer to sell a specific credit rating from AAA all the way down, I think, to D, if the issuing agency qualifies. The ratings indicate the likely value of the bond. Without the explicit and direct participation of the credit rating agencies, it would have been impossible for Puerto Rico to sell $70 billion of debt or acquire millions in bank borrowings. The rating agencies have strong policies and procedures. It would be impossible to commit $70 billion in fraud without the explicit knowledge and approval of the executives and the board of directors at the rating agencies. It would also be statistically impossible for Moody's, Fitch, and S&P to all miss the same critical underwriting issues without some form of collusion or antitrust issues. So how do they do it? Well, let me share that with you. When you apply for a small personal loan, the bank may assign a recent college graduate with 1 to 2 years experience to review your request and make a decision. When a municipal agency applies for $1 billion, the bank will assign a team of highly educated and experienced underwriters to review the request. The team will then go to a committee, and the committee may go to the board of directors. It's a very extensive process. And when selling that bond, there's a lead bank, and a series of junior bank participants. Once approved, all parties sell the bonds to their pool of investors. The banks and credit rating agencies every year make billions of dollars selling credit ratings and new bonds. I want to take a look back to the 2008 financial collapse. In the period between 2006 and 2008, there was a financial crisis. It was well known today and undisputed that the rating agencies knowingly sold fraudulent ratings. No one was ever prosecuted. And back during this financial crisis, the product that they used to do this was collateralized debt obligations or pools of residential mortgages that were predicted to perform poorly but given good credit ratings. In the 2006 to 2008 financial crisis, it was well known and undisputed today that the banks knowingly sold mislabeled troubled debt as safe investments to their investors. I don't think anybody would dispute that. Rating agencies and banks make billions and share that income as political contributions with our legislators. In the 2008 financial crisis, trillions were lost, and only one UBS banker was ever prosecuted. The political contributions the bank make seem to pay real dividends. You or I or Bernie Madoff would be in jail for the rest of our lives. There was $6 trillion in wealth that disappeared during the 2008 financial crisis. And again, if these investments were made with honest and forthright information and the investors made knowledgeable choices and parted with their money based on the best decisions that they feel they could make, then it was an investment loss. But if fraud and deceit were used to part the investors with their money, it's clear, simple fraud, criminal theft. And based on what we know today, that $6 trillion was stolen. Why did everybody knowingly participate in the 2008 financial fraud? Issuing ratings is the primary profit center for the rating agencies. Selling bonds is the major profit center for the banks. In some cases, it's even the largest profit center. The bond issuers could never repay the bondholders from their operating income, so they need to bring in new investors or new bonds more frequently before the old investors figure out it was all a scam in the first place. And this is what everybody refers to as a Ponzi scheme, and it's the same exact thing that Bernie Madoff went to jail for. If the rating agencies and banks generate $10 billion in revenue, and then the rating agencies and banks are caught and pay $2 billion in fines, it's a good business decision. And Congress makes sure no one is ever criminally prosecuted. So why not do it? In the 2008 financial crisis, it took many years to get the SEC and others to issue fines. And when no one in the press was paying attention, Congress let the rating agencies and banks pay a big piece of these fines with tax credits. Tax credits created and passed by guess who? Congress. Now I want to share with you our findings as it relates to the Puerto Rico financial crisis. The first item on CSP's checklist when looking at a project is the overall credit rating of the utility. With a good credit rating, without a good credit rating, we're unlikely to get financing for our project, and if built, we're unlikely to get paid for the electricity we produce. It is not normal to read the bond offering documents. You typically trust the ratings that are posted for public consumption, and you move on. With a BBB rating on PREPA, we had no initial concerns. That's a superior rating for utilities, or a utility company. After years of working with PREPA on this project, and witnessing all sorts of bizarre behavior, the utility finally and unilaterally canceled all $1.5 billion of solar projects. CSP lost $13.2 million, and the company's founders and executives lost everything. At the request of the CSP Board of Directors, I was asked to do a forensic investigation to better understand what had happened to us and to prevent it from happening again in the future. What we're looking at now on the presentation screen is a typical municipal bond offering. These documents are really just legal templates, and every time a bond issue is made, they fill in the blanks on the template and they move forward. So once you know how to read one municipal bond offering, theoretically you can read and understand them all. So I want to take you through this bond offering fairly quickly and give you a feel for how it's laid out. Every bond offering is laid out. If you take a look at the top right-hand portion of the bond offering, you'll notice the three rating companies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And next to their names are the credit ratings that they have assigned to this bond. And those credit ratings are indicative of what they believe this bond risk is. So they are making a predictive statement that the risk associated with these bonds is equal to or better than the ratings that they've assigned it. Below that, you'll notice that this bond is for $673,145,000. They've assigned a name to it, a Power Revenue Bond Series 2013A. The bond issuer can give the bond almost any name it would like. Typically, it relates to the the municipality that is floating the bond. Below the bond offering is a description of the general bond offering, and below that is a list of all the banks that are participating in selling this bond. If you look at the top line, you can see Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo Securities, and for some reason, they're slightly larger and bold and more bold than the other banks. Citigroup, Barclays, J.P. Morgan, and that's indicative of the role they played in selling these bonds. Typically, there's a lead bank or a series or a number of lead banks that get together and offer to sell these bond investments to their clients. And to make sure the bond investment sells out, they'll often ask other banks, refer to them as junior banks, to participate along with them and sell these bonds to their customers as well. And one thing I want to make clear, there's a ton of communication between Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo Bank and the junior banks that are participating. There's also communication between the credit rating agency and the banks, and between the issuing municipality. Anytime you want to look for a bond offering, they're public documents and they're widely available on the web simply by doing a search, a Google search. In this case, if you look on the left-hand side, I've identified where you can find all of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority bonds that were issued in perpetuity. And you could look any one up individually and print them or save them or do whatever you like. And then a brief description of credit ratings. There are two types of credit ratings the market recognizes: investment grade and junk bonds. Investment grade ratings are very important because without them, if a municipality was to float a bond, they'd have to pay extremely high interest rates and they'd have to offer the bonds to a much smaller marketplace. Investment grade ratings are generally attractive to the marketplace, and they range anywhere from AAA down to BBB minus. And again, many of the bonds issued for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority fell into this investment grade rating. In fact, none of them were categorized as junk until they actually defaulted. And you can see I've identified the PREPA ratings into the lower middle grade. And for the interest rates they were paying, that would be an attractive investment for most investors. Now, I've worked for 25 years in the banking industry. In fact, I'm thinking it's 28 years. And I could tell you that there are very extensive checklists that are used before considering rating or selling a $600 million transaction. It is also double-checked by various approval committees and reviewed by the board of directors. I want to focus on the three basic criteria that everyone who's involved in issuing debt would want to look at. The first one is cash flow. Does the company have sufficient operating income to make the bond payments? If the company generates $1 in cash and has $1 in debt, they are said to have a coverage ratio of 1 to 1. So let me give you a simple example. If you net $2,000 a month out of your paycheck and you take away your car payment, your utility payments, and a living allowance, you'll have $1,500 left. If you apply for a mortgage that's $1,500 a month, you'd have a 1-to-1 coverage on your home mortgage payment. And everybody understands that you can't function at 1-to-1 coverage because things happen and any hiccup would cause a missed payment. Car breaks down, refrigerator doesn't work, you need a new washing machine. Any of those events would cause you to miss your mortgage payment. The industry standard in issuing debt, mortgage debt, bond debt, bank loan debt, is 1.2 to 1 coverage. If the monthly payment is $100,000, the company needs to have available cash of $120,000 to make that payment. And it's kind of common sense. If your mortgage payment's $1,000 a month, you don't want to have just $1,000 a month to rely on. You want to have $1,200 or more a month, so if something does happen, you have resources to take care of it. So we took a look. The first thing we did is take a look at the cash flow and bond payment coverage that we were seeing on some of these bonds coming out of Puerto Rico. And today, we're going to look at this one specific bond, but I assure you I've looked at a lot of bonds coming out of Puerto Rico and elsewhere, and this is not uncommon. Page 58 of the bond offering shows bond payment coverage of 1.38 to 1. Now, we just discussed that, so this looks pretty good. They have $138,000 to make that $100,000 payment every month. So I'm pretty pleased with that. And this looks like a good bond offering. It's got a triple B minus rating or a triple B plus rating. And at first glance, this looks like a really good opportunity. But as you read more, you see that the accountants used hundreds of millions of dollars per year in income that the utility never collected. In fact, PREPA, the utility, has not collected that income for almost a decade. Using that income is a violation of all known accounting standards, GAAP, government accounting standards, international accounting standards, and there would be no excuse to put that into a bond offering. So you see they were providing a lot of electricity for other government entities on the island, government entities that never paid for it, but they carry it as an account receivable as if it would get paid. If you remove this phantom non-existent income, bond payment coverage drops to 0.82 to 1. Well, if you just gave this company a loan that costs $1,000 a month and they only have $820 a month to pay for it, and you're telling the investors that are buying into this that it's a good investment, you clearly committed criminal fraud. Because on the surface, It's crystal clear. This utility does not have sufficient income to make any payments on the bonds. How could the experienced banking teams, the approval committees, and the board of directors at the rating agencies and banks have missed this? It would be impossible. I've been in this business forever. I grew up in it. It's the first thing we look for. Yet they are telling the public that this is an investment grade bond, and this is clear and unquestioned and provable fraud. Now, to make matters worse and drive home the fact that the rating agency banks knowingly and intentionally misled the public in exchange for hearty fees, you can look at the bond memorandum on page 59, and it states that PREPA had to borrow additional money to make all the payments on the money they just borrowed. And that's a pure Ponzi scheme. You bring in new money to pay the early investors off before the whole house of cards collapses. This also leads me to bank fraud, since if you read the small print, the line of credit they secured was supposed to be used for fuel purchases and some other auxiliary things, but never used to pay bond debt. I reviewed all the bond issues from PREPA between 2007 and 2014, and I found actual bond payment coverage on the offerings, minus the cash that is unaccounted for in these principal entities, to be between 0.62 and 0.82. In no case could PREPA make any of those bond payments from normal business operation or business operations, yet all the bonds were given good ratings. Now, how the heck does that accidentally happen? Now I want to talk a little bit about collateral. The second criteria that any competent banker would look at, whether it's selling a bond or making a loan, if the borrower cannot make payments what assets does a company have that can be sold to repay the debt? In our earlier example, we spoke about mortgage payments. Well, if you don't make your mortgage payment, the bank would foreclose on your property and then resell it to pay off their mortgage loan. Well, the same is true with a bond, a municipal bond, or any bank loan. If the debtor, the borrower, cannot make the payments, what assets does this borrower have that could be resold to pay off the investors? Now, according to the financials in the bond offering memorandum, PREPA has assets of $10,253 million and liabilities of $10,253 million, giving the company a net worth of zero. Now, this is a little misleading on the surface if you're not into accounting, because it's assets equal liabilities plus owner's equity. And an example of owner's equity would be equity in your home, equity in your car, cash in the bank that's not guaranteed to somebody else. But the case with PREPA is they virtually have no owner equity. They have nothing of any real value, so they truly do have a net worth of zero. But as you read the small print, two major items should be noted. PREPA claims $1.2 billion in accounts receivable when they have a long history of never collecting those receivables. So if you deduct that, which would be realistic and conservative way to look at this, they'd have a negative net worth. The company also openly admits it has legally unfunded pension liabilities of $1.7 billion. Using their version of accounting that suits them best, actual unfunded liabilities may be twice that due to these creative reporting strategies. But any honest accounting of PREPA's balance sheet should show a materially negative net worth. And when you have inadequate cash flow and a negative net worth, you are technically bankrupt. Yet, the rating agency said it was a good deal. These poor investors have no fallback, no safety net. but they were led to believe they did. But now is when things get really scary and shocking. The last item you should look at when making a loan of any type is the character of the borrower. Can you trust that information that they are giving to you? Is the company well managed? The very first thing I notice is that every bond offering includes material money for upgrades and equipment maintenance. In this bond offering, it was $500 million. In other bond offerings, it ranged from $200 million to $500 million. Remarkably, this money disappears and the upgrades are never done. A simple review of multiple bond offerings often reflects money for the same things from period to period or year to year. Any competent banker would have picked up on that. There is significant evidence that an average of $300 million a year is being stolen from these accounts. Numerous bond covenants, and a bond covenant is a promise. So within the bond, the borrower might say to you, if for some reason I can't make a bond payment, I will raise my rates so that I have enough money to make the bond payments in the future. Or I won't borrow, another different type of promise might be, I won't borrow any additional money without bondholder approval. Whatever the promise may be, they put it into the bond offering because they want to give the bond buyer a sense of safety and security, and they want to be able to sell these bonds at a lower interest rate to a larger audience. But in the case of PREPA, and for that matter, almost all bonds issued throughout Puerto Rico, these promises have been broken, but they continue to be cited by both the rating agencies, the issuing agency, and the banks as protection for the bondholders. Obvious and direct evidence of fraud. Now, in this particular bond issue, I want to draw your attention to the 14 pages of EPA violations. 14 pages. I can hardly believe it. It's not good for a utility company. It's clear that the only way the utility could incur these violations is if they were illegally burning sludge oil. It also indicates very poor management. How do I know these things? I simply read the document. Most utilities will burn number 2 fuel oil. Number 2 is a high-grade, low-polluting oil that is good for the environment and the utility's equipment. If you look at the EPA violations and the heavy equipment maintenance, it is indicative of a utility burning sludge oil, also referred to as number 6 oil. When checking the PREPA's equipment, it was set up to burn the sludge oil because different equipment is used for higher grade oil. How do I know that? If I'm going to make them a $600 million loan, I'm going to go look at their power plants and see what kind of condition their equipment's in. I checked the oil purchase account, and it was clear that they were paying for high-grade number 2 oil, but taking delivery of sludge oil. That's a 58% price difference in the 2 oils, and oil is the largest expense for a utility company. In this accounting period, the utility paid $2.6 billion for fuel oil, and the utility overpaid $1.5 billion because they took delivery of the sludge oil. And you have to ask yourself, where'd that money go? We now have $300 million in equipment funds missing and $1.5 billion in overpayments for oil. This looks like a multi-billion-dollar a year criminal enterprise, excluding the fraudulent $9 billion this utility or municipal agency floated. Next, we looked at pending lawsuits. Every large corporation has some number of pending lawsuits. PREPA is no different. some of the suits except that, I should say, that some of the suits against them are being filed under the RICO Act. Well, RICO is racketeering, influence, and corrupt organizational practices. It's the part of the law that was enacted to break up the mafia, organized crime. Why does PREPA have RICO lawsuits filed against them? And why are private parties filing these charges and not the Department of Justice? These suits have very material damages associated with them, and when challenged in court numerous times, they've been upheld. How could the MBAs and the PhDs at the rating agencies and banks think that RICO charges associated with possibly huge company-ending settlements qualified PREPA as an investment-grade borrower or even trustworthy? The agency lacked cash to make any bond payments. They had a negative net worth and so many character flaws that if they were an individual, they couldn't qualify for a $2,500 bank loan. Yet, for the right fees, they could borrow almost $10 billion. I then decided to look at the other Puerto Rico bond issues. I looked at Puerto Rico Municipal Financing Agency, Puerto Rico Aqueduct and Sewer Authority, Puerto Rico Sales Tax Financing, Puerto Rico Highways and Transportation. I looked at all of them. And in some cases, you're going to find this hard to believe, they were in worse shape than PREPA. In all cases, there were material issues. And that leads me to the next question. Was the Puerto Rico financial collapse caused by excessive government theft of public monies or their economy? With billions of dollars going unaccounted for each year, the prior looks more likely than the latter. They issued $70 billion in bonds, and simply by paying the right fee, they got the credit rating they desired. I also pulled a few bond issues from Chicago, Connecticut, California, and New York. And this practice seems to be pretty widespread. It's not limited to just Puerto Rico. You can see some of the recent articles that have been posted in the paper. I put some up here to give you a feel for it. SEC accuses Chicago underwriters of a municipal bond offering fraud. They fine them $500,000. They pay the fine. They do it again. Why not? They're not going to go to jail, and the fines are far less than the money they make doing it. Court upholds RICO claims against defendants in Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. This is back in April, when they were still getting decent ratings. Where were the rating agencies and the banks? What were they looking at? Puerto Rico Senate turns over a fraud probe to FBI. This is in March of 2016. How Wall Street's greedy plans to fleece Puerto Rico are fueling the island's independence movement. PREPA took kickbacks from fuel oil suppliers. I mean, this is all public information. Anybody with the access to the internet could look it up. I wrapped up all the information that I put together in this presentation, and I sent it by Federal Express to the Puerto Rico FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office. I also sent it electronically by email to all Puerto Rico legislators, their version of our congressmen and senators. 60 to 90 days later, I filed a whistleblower report with the SEC and the IRS and notified the Treasury Department about my findings. I sent a Federal Express package of this information to the Board of Directors for Moody's, Fitch, and S&P. To no avail, because S&P, knowing about all this fraud, just signed a contract with PREPA less than 60 days ago for $328,000 to help secure them better credit ratings. I kid you not. The credit rating agencies as a group appear to be continuing to issue new unjustified ratings for hundreds of billions of dollars. why the FBI, the U.S. Treasury Department, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the SEC, and our legislators do nothing. I faxed a copy of this information to all 435 congressmen and 100 senators. I faxed this information to all assistant FBI directors in all of the 50 states. I went to my congressman, Duncan Hunter, and my 2 federal senators, Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein. We had a successful company in their district that lost hundreds of high-paying jobs in a green industry. They'd help, right? No. No interest in meeting with me or helping. All 3 later voted for legislation that prevents the victims of this crime from suing Puerto Rico, revoking all legal rights for the bondholders as well. But now it gets really interesting. While I patiently waited to hear back from everybody, I penciled an editorial about all of this, and it was widely published throughout the Caribbean. 24 hours later, I received a block call from Alexandria, Virginia. The person on the phone described themselves as a career government employee. He went on to say that Puerto Rico came onto his radar when the fuel office manager at PREPA began making direct calls to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. These calls were recorded and went on for a number of years. In the calls, it was clear that the fuel office manager for PREPA was working out a deal to buy sludge oil for the utility while paying for good oil. They discussed how the overpayment would be kicked back to the people in Puerto Rico executing this fraud. Over a number of calls, it became clear that the practice was to pay the politician and government bureaucrats' family members and family members of PREPA executives to make it more difficult to detect. The caller went on to state that the calls indicated the family members of the local FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office were also receiving kickbacks, and that is why this has gone on for over a decade. It was clear that the caller I was talking to was very frustrated and said as much. He suggested I deal only with the Washington FBI offices. Well, I wasn't sure what to make of this. I wasn't sure I believed it. He was possibly a CIA officer, although he never directly said it. He certainly implied it. I wrote another editorial adding this strange call to the story. 2 days later, the Caribbean News Now news agency printed the story below, stating that they were able to use their agency contacts to confirm everything that I had been told by this person. Well, I reported this to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney, and they referred me back to the Puerto Rico office. No kidding. If you recall, I said I electronically sent all Puerto Rico legislators a copy of my findings. I am not sure what role that played, but the Puerto Rico Senate convened a special committee to investigate this, and many municipal agency executives and vendors were interviewed under oath. Below is a copy of the actual summary document that they published. It's also a copy of this in your press kit on the flash drive, and it'll be available on the internet in our data room. In the Senate committee final report, one municipal executive after the other took the stand under oath and explained that the credit rating agencies and banks were fully aware they could not repay this debt, but for the right fee, they could get a good credit rating, and the banks would look the other way and sell the debt. If the one executive show up with 2 attorneys and refuse to answer any questions and then finally walk out of the committee meeting was the fuel purchase manager for PREPA. Curious. The report went on to say PREPA's current economic insolvency was the product of, among other factors, negligent acts on the part of its creditors, who, in spite of knowing that PREPA's financial and competitive situation was weak and knowing that its infrastructure was obsolete, they negligently granted PREPA a good credit rating, disregarding that by 2010, PREPA was technically bankrupt. The fact PREPA was insolvent was corroborated by the lead CPA and consulting partner at Ernst & Young, their accounting firm, who has audited PREPA for the past 12 years, giving PREPA a going concern annual audit, which is another criminal fraud. It gets even more bizarre from here. As it became clear that Puerto Rico was on the verge of financial collapse, the administration appointed Secretary Liu from the Treasury Department to head up the efforts to find a solution. Secretary Liu was the COO in charge of Citibank, and Citibank was among the first banks to sell these fraudulent bonds while he was COO. Secretary Liu also called on his assistant Treasury counsels Antonio Weiss and Stephen Campbell, both of which failed to be confirmed by the Senate because of their Wall Street ties. Well, no surprise here. Weiss and Campbell worked for Lazard. They played senior partner roles, and they had extensive interest in the Puerto Rico bond mess while they worked at Lazard. Lazard is the world's leading financial advisory firm. Neither Liu, Weiss, or Campbell disclosed their obvious conflicts of interest to Congress. Now, this is the frustrating part. In 2008, the Department of Justice and our legislators pretended, along with our regulatory agencies, that they couldn't possibly charge anybody on Wall Street criminally, even though they perpetrated much of what I'm sharing with you today. In my opinion, a second-year accounting student could have gotten together with a second-year law student and prosecuted and convicted everybody from the board of directors down to the lowest level officers. But for some reason, it was too complex for the U.S. Attorney, the FBI, the Treasury Department, and although the SEC does not prosecute, they certainly can find individuals. Well, I filed a conflict of interest with the Treasury Department about Weiss, Liu, and Campbell, and it was completely ignored. I should note that Secretary Liu was fully informed about all this fraud, and I know this to be a fact, but still pushed for a full taxpayer bailout until it was clear he could not get that through Congress. So he knew the money was stolen, he knew there was fraud in the municipality, and he wanted the taxpayers to cover it up with their tax dollars. Why not? His former employer was involved. His assistant's former employer was involved, and all would benefit greatly if this was buried under a load of tax dollars. Liu, Weiss, and Campbell settled on PROMESA. PROMESA is an acronym for a piece of legislation that strips all the legal rights that these bondholders normally would have and prevents them from filing any lawsuits. So you have a government official who knows that these bonds were issued fraudulently, that the municipalities were engaging in massive theft, and how do they respond? They punish the victims. They pass a law telling the victims they no longer have any legal rights and they can't sue to protect themselves. In addition to that, we're going to confiscate whatever money is left from this bond offering, and a small group of Wall Street professionals selected by our politicians will decide how that money gets allocated. And word is already that they're looking at taking away the bond money from the bond holders and possibly redirecting it to pay for unpaid union pensions through no fault of the bondholders. Another interesting footnote, is Paul Ryan was against any Puerto Rico bailout, and he was against PROMESA. Makes sense, he's a conservative. Conservatives want to abide by the rule of law, not rewrite it. Ryan actually said either option would violate every conservative principle he stood for. After meeting with Secretary Lew, though, he changed his mind, and the following contributions quickly rolled into Ryan's reelection fund. If you take a look at these, every single one of them has a significant interest in the Puerto Rico bond mess. And here again are some articles. It would have been easy for anybody who had access to the internet to put together. Jack Lew had a major role at Citigroup when it nearly imploded. Failed nominee Weiss morphs into key debt official at Treasury, so on and so forth. And under expanding regulatory authority in Dodd-Frank, the SEC claims to be charging CFOs with security law violations, even when they had no knowledge of this prohibited activities. If you were in charge, the theory is, you are guilty. Well, we put the guy in charge of this mess, in charge of the fraud, in charge of the solution. Only our government can do that. In 2006 to 2008, the RICO laws existed, and as you can see from my examples, prosecution of these Wall Street criminals would have been pretty easy. Congress pretended they could not prove guilt and passed the Dodd-Frank legislation to calm the American people. Dodd-Frank legislation makes it easy to prosecute individuals and companies. It also makes it much easier to hold executives and directors responsible. To date, Dodd-Frank has rarely ever been used, and when it is used, it is typically used against less powerful individuals or small companies. The Congress and the administration has made it known to the DOJ that Wall Street is off limits. Over the 15 months I've been working with the FBI, I had multiple opportunities to talk with FBI personnel off the record, and they left me with three consistent thoughts. Rich, you're wasting your time. This will never go anywhere, number one. Number two, Rich, our assistant FBI directors and our FBI director are more interested in preserving their positions, preserving or enhancing their positions, than they are in serving the American people. And when their phone rings and it's the Attorney General or the President, they're quick to drop their pants and bend over their desk and throw the American people under the bus. And the third thing I heard that was equally disturbing was that they see cases every day where rich and powerful individuals are breaking the law and they feel they could build a good case. And most of the time they don't even bother. Because even if they're lucky enough to have an assistant director that they report to that's willing to consider it, they know once they do all the hard work and it goes up to the U.S. Attorney's Office, it will go through a political screening and be killed on arrival. I propose that if the field officers from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI were interviewed under oath regarding these criminal complaints that I've made and others have made, would the Attorney General and the FBI Director be charged with obstruction of justice? I can only draw one conclusion from the multitude of feedback I received, and that is yes, they'd be guilty of obstruction of justice. You've seen the evidence. These agencies have had this information for the better part of a year. The FBI's had it for 15 months. Can't seem to figure it out. They seem baffled by it. It's too complicated, too confusing. Doesn't work. The SEC's had it for a year. Experts at this stuff. What have they done? Absolutely nothing. And while the SEC, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office sit on their hands, the credit rating agencies continue to sell unjustified credit ratings and hundreds of billions of dollars, and municipal bonds are flooding our market, and continue to flood our market, until the day comes when there's a gust of wind and the whole house of cards comes crumbling down, just like the 2008 financial collapse. Preliminary reviews of the municipal bond issues throughout the 50 states, and I did this on a fairly small sampling because I'm only an office of 1 or 2 at this point. I pulled 40 ratings, 40 bonds, and it indicated that as much as 55% of the bonds I looked at throughout the market across the United States carry dangerously misleading credit ratings that will guarantee massive future losses for unsuspecting and defenseless Americans. And the one thing that we can count on as Americans is that our legislators are getting more bold. Now they're saying not only are we going to protect Wall Street, but we're going to revoke all your legal rights so that you can't interfere with the status quo. Puerto Rico alone has seen $36 billion stolen, not lost. It was stolen. And there's much more to follow. Our senior citizens, when it comes to municipal bonds, are being targeted. And Congress's response is don't let victims sue. If there's any questions and answers, I'd be happy to take those at this time. And if you think of something after this conference is over, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. I have put my contact information on the last page of the presentation. I've also supplied you with a document link, which would give you copies of all the documents that I've referenced in this presentation, as well as proof that I've contacted the FBI, the 435 congressmen, the 100 senators, and that they indeed had all this information at their fingertips long before they voted to revoke all bondholders' rights. Any questions I could help answer? Are we getting any on the online system? Okay. We're going to give you a minute and before we wrap this up. And if any come in, we'll go ahead and answer those. And thank you again for attending. All right, if there's no further questions, we're going to close out today. But again, feel free to contact me by email or phone, and I'll do what I can to assist. Thank you again. Bye-bye now.